Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to Bookspin. So I thought I'd try doing something a little bit different today. I'm going to talk about some of my favourite non-science fiction books. So it's a bit of a departure from the norm, as this is a sci-fi focused channel, but I thought it'd be quite interesting to look at some of the things I enjoy reading outside of the genre. So I've put together this list of 10 of my favourite non science fiction books that I've read over the years. Let's dive in. At number 10, we have Japanese Tales of Mystery and Imagination by Edogawa Rampo. Now, Edogawa Rampo was a 20th century Japanese writer. He wrote a lot of mystery fiction and horror and weird fiction. And Edogawa Rampo wasn't his real name, that was his pen name. It's basically a Japanese approximation of Edgar Allan Poe, who was a major influence on his work. And just like a Poe, his stories are filled with mystery and macabre. I've read a couple of his novels, but I think where he really stands out is in his short stories. And this collection I can recommend. It's full of creepy and weird tales. It's got recurring themes of murder mystery and morbid horror. And just to give you an example, there's one story which particularly stands out to me, the most memorable one, I think. It's called The Human Chair. And unlike a lot of his stories, this one isn't a whodunit, it's just a straight up horror. And it's very unsettling. It's a kind of confessional narrative about a man who designs a sofa that he's able to hide inside. And he goes on these bizarre adventures where he's living inside this sofa. And it sounds really weird, and it is weird. It's also very creepy, and it's got a genuinely frightening twist. So, if you like horror, if you like creepy detective fiction, and if you like weird tales, I can definitely recommend this collection. Number 9, Soldier of the Mist by Gene Wolfe. Now, Gene Wolfe was a very talented fantasy writer. I've read several of his novels. I think this one is probably my favourite. It's a historical fantasy set in ancient Greece. And we've got a very interesting first-person protagonist who is a soldier who's suffered a major head injury before the events of the novel. And this injury has given him brain damage, affecting his memory. And what this means is he forgets everything about his life. The only things that he can remember are the events that have happened in that day. So every time he goes to sleep, he forgets everything about himself. So what he does is he writes a diary to record what happens every day. And then he wakes up in the morning and he has to reread his diary to remind himself of who he is and what he's doing in life. And this novel is his diary. So it's a very interesting premise, but it gets even more interesting because this head injury has also given him some strange kind of mystical powers which aren't available to normal people. So he can see the gods of the ancient world and he can communicate with them. So it's a very interesting premise. It's a bit of a disorientating read because of his amnesia, he's a bit of an unreliable narrator. So he sometimes contradicts himself. He'll write something in one chapter and then say something different a few chapters later, or he appears to misremember things or interpret things differently to the way the reader might expect. So it's a classic kind of unreliable narrator trope which is something Gene Wolfe is quite well known for. I think Wolfe does an excellent job of creating a cohesive and engaging narrative using this device. He pulls it off really well, and it's a really atmospheric and engaging world that he creates in ancient Greece, and it's a fascinating kind of character study. And so I read this as part of a duology called Latro in the Mist, which includes the first book, Soldier of the Mist, and its sequel, Soldier of Arete. And both of these were published in the 1980s. And then later on, Gene Wolfe wrote a third book called Soldier of Sidon, in which the narrator ends up in Egypt. And the third book is also very good. It's really beautiful world building. It really manages to capture a kind of atmospheric, mystical landscape of ancient Egypt. All in all, it's a great series, and I highly recommend it. Number 8, Pet Sematary by Stephen King. Now, this is considered by some to be one of the greatest horror novels ever. I don't think I've read enough Stephen King or enough horror in general to make that kind of judgment, but it is a profoundly terrifying story, and Stephen King himself has described this as his scariest ever story. And it's typical of King. It's got great character building and an utterly absorbing plot. So we have a story in which there's a family who moves to a new town, and deep within the woods behind their new home, there exists an ominous graveyard. It's a kind of pet burial ground, and it's rumoured to have the power to bring the dead back to life. So this story moves from very dark to very tragic to truly terrifying, and it's just done so well. It's a real gut wrench of a novel. It's not just scary, but it's emotionally devastating, and I think it's great. 7, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. I don't think this book needs any introduction. I'm using this book to represent the whole series, probably the most hyped book series of all time. So I was about 10 or 11, I think, when I read this book. And I remember being so captivated by the characters and the world that J.K. Rowling created. And growing up, there weren't that many other books that captured my imagination in quite the same way. These books were really addictive to read. I remember eagerly anticipating each new book when it was going to be released. It's great fantasy, magical world building, interesting and memorable characters, and an exciting story. So yeah, as these books came out, my age roughly corresponded to the age Harry was and his peers in each book. So I think that helped me to sort of relate to the characters more. I'm not sure if these books would appeal to me again now, but certainly at the time they came out, they helped to fuel my love for reading. And some of them I read multiple times, so I think they're definitely worth including in this list. At number 6, we have The Arabian Nights. And I think this book really showcases the magical power of literature to transport you to another time and place, which is full of fanciful tales from a bygone era. And it's amazing to think that these folk tales were first collected around 1,000 years ago. They're so dramatic and colourful and exotic. It's just absorbing to read. It's the kind of book that you can just dip into any time for some pure escapism. And the version which I have is the classic Richard Burton translation from the 1880s, which is very fanciful and archaic in the way it's written. And it really captures the exotic mood of the stories. And I should say my copy is actually a selection of stories. Here it is. Tales from the Arabian Nights. If you want to read the whole thing in its entirety, it's going to take you a while because it's ridiculously long. The 1001 Nights. I think Burton's complete translation amounted to 17 volumes. But there are a lot of classics in here. So we've some of the most famous stories which I enjoyed. Things like Sinbad the Sailor, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp. And if you've ever read any of the children's versions of these stories, you'll find that the versions here in the Burton translation are much longer and more complex, and there are more plot twists. And there's definitely more adult content. There's some pretty shocking violence. And there's a lot of misogyny and racism and anti-Semitism. So don't go into these fables expecting them to reflect anything like modern values. But they are definitely very colourful and very entertaining. 5. Guns, Germs and Steel by Jared Diamond. Now this is one of my all-time favourite non-fiction books. I think Jared Diamond is a really fascinating writer. He's written a lot of interesting popular science books in fields like anthropology and geography and history and evolutionary biology. And this was the book that introduced me to his work. It's a really interesting look back on human history since the dawn of agriculture. So the last 13,000 years, he explores the rise of civilizations across the globe. And particularly what he's looking at is why certain societies developed faster than others, and how certain civilizations went on to achieve geopolitical dominance. And he looks at not just the proximate causes for this, but the ultimate causes, which Diamond proposes lie in geography and in the contrasts in physical surroundings of where people live. And I think he makes a very compelling argument. There's a lot of detail in here. You learn a lot of interesting things about the history of different cultures around the world. It's a very ambitious book. It's very interesting and enjoyable to read. And once you've read it, you feel like you've got a better understanding of how the world came to be the way it is and the roots of inequality of wealth and power across the globe. 4. The Third Policeman by Flann O'Brien. Now this is a pretty strange one. It's a surreal, absurdist novel. It's pretty mind-boggling. In fact, it's probably the strangest book I've ever read. But it's also one of the funniest. There's lots of dark humour in here. There's absurd humour. It's a kind of philosophical crime story, if you like, set in a remote Irish village where there's some very bizarre goings on, and it even features a two-dimensional police station. It's kind of hard to explain. This book is it defies description or categorization. I think you just need to read it and experience it in order to appreciate it. Anyway, I loved it. I've read it twice, and I think I definitely would like to reread it again soon. 3. The Summer of the Ubume by Natsuhiko Kyogoku. So this is a mystery horror novel. It's set in Japan in the 1950s, and I think it's superbly done. It's very creepy and atmospheric, It's a kind of detective story with a bizarre locked room mystery case. We've got a missing man, and his wife is got some kind of abnormal pregnancy. She's believed to have been pregnant for 20 months without having given birth. So we've got some strange circumstances going on in this wealthy household who hire a private detective to investigate. The mystery deepens and things get increasingly intricate and bizarre. So it's quite a strange story, but it's also a very dark tale, and it does get quite horrific at times. And if you're wondering what Ubume means in the title, this is the ghost of a woman who has died during childbirth. So the author is in fact a specialist in Japanese folklore and traditional ghost stories, which he often uses as a basis for his stories. So anyway, I can highly recommend The Summer of the Ubume. It's just a shame that this author isn't better known in the West. I hope more people can discover this book, and I really want more of his works to be translated into English. At number 2, we have Swann's Way by Marcel Proust, which is one of the absolute classics of modern literature. It's the first book of In Search of Lost Time, which is famous for being one of the longest novels of all time, published originally in 7 volumes. Now, you don't have to read the whole thing, though. If you want to appreciate the beauty of Proust's writing, you could just read Swann's Way, which is a self-contained story in its own right. It is a bit of a challenging read, though. The prose is very dense, and there are a lot of very long sentences and paragraphs. So you do have to be patient when reading this. It's not something you can rush through. It's basically a fictionalized story of Proust's life, where he reminisces on his childhood and growing up as a young adult in French high society in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. It's not a book you can read quickly, as I said. When I was reading it, I just read it in small segments, 10 pages a day for the most part, and I balanced that out with other books. But I am glad that I read it. I went on to read all 7 volumes, and it took me about a year and a half to finish all of the books. So it was a long haul, but there's a lot of beauty and wisdom and profundity within these pages if you can make time for them. But that said, if you are interested in Proust but don't want to make such a big commitment, there is a very good graphic novel adaptation of Swann's Way, which I have here. This is my copy. It's a very beautiful adaptation by Stefan Way, and I think it perfectly captures Proust in a more accessible way. It's got some lovely, colourful illustrations that capture the mood of the novel. This is the only one that I have in graphic novel form, but you can definitely read this as a standalone, I think. And at number 1, we have American Gods by Neil Gaiman. Now, this book has quite a special place in my heart. Neil Gaiman is one of my favourite writers, and American Gods is my favourite of everything he's done. It's a really rich and interesting novel with quite deep themes and fascinating world building. It's a kind of epic fantasy set in modern day America. And in this story, we've got the gods of the ancient world living within American society. And they live on through the myths and the imaginations of the immigrants who brought them there. But they are increasingly under threat from the new gods of the modern world, representing things like technology and media. So this is the backdrop to the world that Gaiman creates. And in this story, we follow a POV character who's just come out of prison as he tries to make sense of this world. So it sort of turns into a kind of bizarre road trip. It's got some very interesting, some very enigmatic characters. Totally absorbing, I think. The world building is second to none. The characters are fascinating, and there's a definite sense of mystery and atmosphere that builds and accumulates as the novel develops. So I first read this book when I was 17, and it really opened up my mind to just how wonderful and absorbing a great book can be. And it kind of encouraged me to read more, because as a teenager I didn't read that much, nowhere near as much as I do now. But after I discovered Neil Gaiman, I realized just how much I can enjoy reading. So I went on to read everything else by him. So it kind of inspired, in a way, my lifelong love of reading. So that's why I think it deserves to be here at the number one spot. So a couple of years after I read this, I went on to meet Neil Gaiman at a book signing at Forbidden Planet in London. And that's where I got him to sign my copy of this book here. Here's a photo from that event. I was 19 at the time. I've since reread this book a few times, and I love it to this day. And that completes the list. Thanks for watching. Let me know what your thoughts are on any of these books down in the comments, and I'll see you again soon.